Susan and I met in Vienna, out of all places. It was a big international conference. I assisted, part of the parenting SERG meetings were discussions, and of course the drinks after the discussions that we would have at the conference. And Susan and I met at that point in a 5 à 7, where we were able to sort of chit chat. And it was a pretty special trip, I think, for Susan, because she was just about, or had just about, graduated with her PhD, and she was presenting the result that she'll be discussing, that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm really, really happy to have you, Susan, come and join and have a little chat with me about that time, which was, I don't know how many years ago. Do you remember?
I do. I think it was 2014. Yes, 2014, Marjorie. So 8 years ago. Yes, wow. Exactly now, in the middle of the year, July, in fact. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, well, that means that I was already in a wheelchair.
Yes.
I had forgotten about that part. So see, I'm like telling a story and I'm imagining myself like standing up, which is like, still baffles me how I could do that. And my brain could still see me, standing up after all those years.
And in fact, we had met at the IAS 2 years before, I think 2 years before, in Halifax. Or actually 2010, mate. No, 2012.
12, yeah.
But I think that was a bit of a whirlwind for you.
It was like my first trip after the accident. So that was pretty big for me, for sure. Mm. So tell me, Susan, how did you end up working in the field of parenting, parents and parenting with intellectual disability?
And thank you so much for having me, Marjorie. It's a delight to talk to you as always. So I, as many of the research community from Australia, I came to this research through a now emerita, Professor Gwyneth Llewellyn, who has been sort of a driving, leading force in Australia in sort of highlighting the issues and highlighting the need for research for many decades now. And so I just had my third child, and I was moving from professional roles, community work as a caseworker, into a research role. I'd done a Master's of Public Health, and I had got a job to work on Healthy Start and to work for one of the large NGOs that was part of that. And through that met Gwyneth and the team at the University of Sydney. And my role was, I was actually employed at the NGO and doing research for a project they ran that was offering sort of group-based support and casework support to parents with intellectual disability. Through that evaluation that I did of their project, I got to know the team and Gwyneth and started doing my PhD. I also came to it with some lived experience. I have a sister with an intellectual disability. She is not a mother, though she would have loved to have been a mother. But I think, like a lot of people who have lived experience of disability, we are passionate, I guess, about hearing those stories and advocating, I suppose, research to practice and research to advocate for inclusion, genuine inclusion of people with disability, and in my case, particularly intellectual disability. So that would have been, I started my PhD, I think, in my youngest was 2, so 2009.
Oh. And like you said, I mean, people will have by now heard Gwyneth talk or like conversation with me. And so they know a little bit about Healthy Start. David McConnell also mentioned, about sort of this program. So you said that you worked with Healthy Start, or within Healthy Start?
Yeah. So once I'd started my PhD, I was involved with Healthy Start as part of my PhD because my PhD was interested in children of parents with intellectual disability, And obviously the Healthy Start was about improving the capacity of the workforce to work with parents. And I think Gwyneth was very aware that there had been very little research at that time that was focused on children. And in particular, and what we worked together on, and what my work with Healthy Start and my PhD was actually about bringing the voices of children and young people with that lived experience to bear on the field of parenting. So to hear from children about being raised by parents with intellectual disability.
Yes. And that's actually like a great segue, because we're talking about Healthy Start, sort of your PhD, and two of the 3 documents that you submitted for today's talk were about your PhD. So do you want to go into more, details, what your PhD was exactly, what you looked at, and the kinds of results you got?
So one of the publications that I shared was a chapter for my PhD, which was a literature review of what we knew. So it was obviously an important piece of work for me to ground myself in understanding what we knew so far, and how that knowledge had informed not just research moving forward, but what how practitioners understood the needs of children living in these families, headed by a parent with intellectual disability. It was a really good experience to do that, because what I came to understand from that was that we generally had thought about children as being at risk. So we really didn't have a lot of evidence for children who did well. And I think this is the case with this field, and we know this, that we tend to, where parents show up, they're parents who are struggling with a lot of intersectional issues related to disadvantage, not just disability. And that was playing out in the research about children. So they were seen as an at-risk group. And I guess that framed really importantly my thinking about this group of children, and the silencing of any stories that were about resilience, that were about strength and family, families that were working well and were doing well. So I guess really wanting to, in some ways, challenge the idea that it's inevitable that children will be doing badly, and we're talking about developmentally, we're talking about out-of-home care placement, and a range of sort of problems socially. So trying to sort of see, well, what happens if we talk to a group of children about their lives, to try to understand how they see their lives at the point of being children. So I was talking to children who were what we would call primary school aged here in Australia, so middle school probably, in the Northern Hemisphere. They were children from about the age of 7 to 12, that middle childhood stage. So I guess in terms of asking about my project, my thesis project, I really needed to think about how to engage children in conversations about their lives that were in ways that were kind of age and stage appropriate. So I started delving into, and this has been, I guess, a really great learning for me, and has really influenced the research I do now. Started thinking about how can you engage people to talk about things where you're not just relying on them, the words they say, you're giving them other tools to speak to their experience. So I had children, I used photo voice, which many people may know about, where you use sort of photo elicitation. So you use photos, you either tape photos or you share photos as part of the research process, to introduce yourself and your world, and explain how you see your world. We also did the young people, children that I talked to did some drawing. We used a sort of eco maps, I guess you could call them, looking at them in the context of their relationships. And I was really interested in ecological systems theory. So seeing the child not just in their home, but seeing how they see themselves in other relationships that are important in their life. So I did that, and I used those sorts of methods, as well as obviously having conversations and discussions with children. Yeah. So
that's very interesting, because like you say, I mean, a lot of people would do research with children, but maybe not think about sort of alternative methods of gathering that information. And I kind of like, you know, using photos in terms of like, how do you introduce, you know, or your world and who you are as a person or as a family, basically. So I think that was definitely very clever.
Yeah.
How many kids were you able to find and interview, and how did those methods were used?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really hard to recruit children for this study, despite me having all of the advantages that came with having good relationships with NGOs myself, through having been working in the NGO sector, plus having all of the relationships that came with Healthy Start. 7. So it was a very, very small study, which was actually a strength of the study because it could go very deep. We were able to go very deep, and I talked to some of the children up to 4 times, which was really important because there was a lot of rapport building in that. I also was really fortunate to be able to be introduced to children through my own professional networks, so not just relying on agencies. I also did talk about gatekeeping, and this is no disrespect meant to professionals and caseworkers. Understand, there are competing demands, and research is not always the main game, especially research where it's not with the person they're working with, which is usually the parent. So you have some sense of, do I really want to, ask the parent to have their child take part in this study, and will the parent feel comfortable? So there were some barriers there, and I think they are well-known barriers. And I actually suspect we've got better over the last decade at embedding ourselves as researchers more closely in the work of our partners in practice, so that we can have those relationships strengthened and enable us to talk to children and families who maybe otherwise are less visible in research and less willing to be part of research. So yes, it was a small study. I can't think of you.
But I think, it's the depth of knowledge, like you mentioned, and I think that's definitely the benefit and the added bonus of your study. And so if we were to talk about sort of like what came out of the study or what results, what would you say were the most striking, or the ones that spoke to you the most?
Yeah. So I think what really shone through across that, all the children's stories, was the importance of really the strength of their relationships with their mothers. So they were all children of mothers with intellectual disability, and none of them had been in out-of-home care. So it was a very select sort of sample too. They were being raised in the community by their mothers, and the big, I guess the thing that was really noticeable was who their mother had in their life to support them from the child's perspective. So, we didn't directly talk about their mum's disability. We talked about their family. We talked about the people in their lives and the other adults. So they got to say, and they got to talk about how those adults supported them, how those adults supported their family. And what was really clear was when mothers had support, that flowed on to their children. Their children felt supported and felt connected to community connected to school. There were bridges built between their home life and their other parts of their social worlds. And what was really striking was, I think, for me, was it was the quality of that relationship and the benefits that were coming to the child. So how much the other adult supported their mother, and also how much that support was directed to the child. So it was about what they were interested in. It wasn't just about parenting skills. It wasn't just about somebody working with their mum. It was about what that person brought to them, and how they supported their life, connecting them with activities in the community, with other people, with making sure they could get to sports, get to their sport, or be part of the other normal things that kids did, like birthday parties and so on. And that didn't have to be a family member. I think that was really striking. It could be a family member. It could be indeed the father of the children, but it didn't have to be. It just needed to be somebody that, as Bronk from Brenner says, really, really cared about that kid, was mad about that kid. So somebody who really was focused on what, on resourcing, if you like, or on supporting that child's development and their interests, including service providers. And I think sometimes we underestimate the role that a service, that's especially one that's around for a long time, can have. Often we have short-term services, and that's problematic, because children's relationships, children need support to develop those relationships. You can't really do that in a 12-month or 2-year service. Yeah.
There's a few things, like I'm listening to you, and there's a few ideas that just pop in my head. First, I think that definitely one added value to your research was definitely that it's focusing on strength, and it wasn't about sort of the families that we often hear in the research papers and that we have thus far, which is often sort of a group that comes from child welfare, or is followed or has been followed in child welfare, which tells us the families that maybe are struggling a little bit more. In your case, it was sort of families that were still together, the kids were not placed. And so that definitely shows in terms of what does it look like when it's those families are doing well, and what elements of that could contribute to them doing well and thriving as a family. And I think that definitely that's, something that's very important. And I hope that people will be reading your article, especially for that reason, to sort of have that positive image that we often do not have. So that was one. And then you also talked about sort of, that support, that it could be people that support the mother, yet it's really about supporting the whole family, which includes the children. And certainly some discussions and interest that I have, and that I've talked to Dr. Margaret Spencer about, and the both of us, is looking at co-parenting arrangements. But co-parenting, when you sort of look at everybody, all those adults that are around each of the children, and how their relationship play out, and how does that work within the family in terms of showing for benefits and support with the children. So I thought that was interesting also, that in your research you mentioned sort of that, in that a community around children or around families is that important. And I will end, and I know that it's more about hearing you than hearing me, but I will say that the other part that I found fascinating is how you mentioned about service providers, and how we usually have short-term, service provider engagement, when in truth for children that might be, somewhat detrimental, and we are doing basically, ill favor to them, because we are basically throwing people that come in and leave very rapidly. So I think that that's something to consider or think about, I think, when we offer services to these children and their family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted
That's,
to add something in terms of like my reflections on that, or should we go on? Because you also mentioned how, your thesis research sort of gave you some knowledge to do other research, which you're
yeah.
currently doing.
Yeah, I would echo definitely everything you say, and that family focused approach, where we don't, where too often, and again, this is systems thinking. It's not necessarily about any individual practitioner, but systems tend to segment. We like to segment. This is the client, and this is the client. And in the case, and I know, as you said, Margaret Spencer talks a lot about this, and we see this in the work that Margaret and I do together, this segmenting of, the parents are, the child's our client, not the parent. And we see this a lot in child welfare. And in fact, but we're also hearing the stories of when it works because we're taking a family-focused approach. And we know from the research that the parents need sustained support, parents with intellectual disability, so do their children. So I think that is the message. This is about embedding and supporting as needs change, and not seeing this as a quick fix. You can get in there and we'll just address that problem. So the child's isolated because the mother is socially isolated. We'll connect them in with some things, then we'll leave. That's not how these things work to help children thrive, as you say. Yeah,
that's a very good point. So tell me now about sort of the types of research that you're conducting, and which led to the third article.
So I am doing more research around looking at how child welfare and also our national disability insurance scheme are working or not working for parents with intellectual disability and their children. I'm doing some research around that at the moment. But what I've been, and that is, I don't have an article to share, but what I've been doing over the last decade really is looking at how to co-design research with people with lived experience. And that's both lived experience of disability and or lived experience of the child welfare system, including as a parent, as a carer, as a young person who was in care, and really trying to find new ways to involve people with that lived experience, not just as research participants, but really as research leaders and partners, co-researchers. And so the third article I shared is based on a project that we did. I did with colleagues at the Research Centre for Children and Families at the University of Sydney, and we were looking to understand how young people with a care background saw this concept of permanency and understood it. It's a very kind of nebulous and imprecise and quite conceptual term, and we're finding in Australia it's leading policy in child protection, and this is not new for, I think, our North American and certainly colleagues in the United Kingdom. Permanency planning has been a feature of the system for a long time, but it's newer to Australia to think about this. We did have children stay in foster care for really long periods of time. We had low rates of permanency through guardianship and adoption, and really low, appallingly low rates of restoration, particularly affecting our First Nations families. So this has really started to drive policy reform, legislative reform over the last sort of 6 or 7 years in New South Wales and in Australia. So we really wanted to say, well, actually, what do we know about what young people say about this? And there was some research from England, in particular, some studies in England that talked to children, but most research had either done surveys or had talked to adults, carers, or children who were then adults. And we wanted to understand what it was like when you had just had left care, what you thought the system should understand about children who are in care and their permanency needs. So we used photo voice. And I thought this was a nice segue for the PhD that I study that we've been talking about. We used photo voice, and it was very much a participatory process of engagement with 11 young people. We did it over 2 years. One of them was during COVID, so it was virtual, where we sort of discussed in big groups the sort of concepts of permanency and started to get some shared understanding with young people. And then they took photographs, and we've just got a publication under review at the moment, talking about, and what was really interesting, this time we did actually analyse their photographs, which I didn't do for my PhD. And really, not only were the words they were using so different to the way that permanency was spoken about in the literature, and also in policy, where the focus was on residential permanency, legal permanency. These are the important things. In fact, it was all about relationships. It was all about connections to people. And it was those really intangible things that the young people reflected on. We had some amazing symbols, lots about nature, which never came up in the research, but this was about immersion in nature as a stabilizing force, even if things were unstable in your own life, that you going and looking at a sunset or a sunrise helped you feel a sense of connection to something beyond yourself, connection to a future, to a hopeful future. Lots of images of the ocean and discussion about water and continuity and flow. So really a lot of symbolism and some beautiful images of what signified feeling home. So one young man who took a photograph of cookies, and he said, what I remember is my foster mum making cookies with me, and that smell was, it's so evocative of home. I felt like I belonged there because we had this shared activity together, and that was home for me. And another couple of people talked about being given a pet, and that didn't matter that someone said, you've got a legal order that says you belong here, this is your address now, you live here. When they were given a pet, their own pet, that meant they were there to stay. So you can see how the meanings that they attached to permanency were really evocative and very visual. And it wouldn't have been the same had they just spoke. This wasn't the stuff that came up in the discussion. It was when they'd taken the photographs and brought them back that they started to really gain some depth of thinking about what they brought to this understanding of how you come to feel a sense of stability and safety when you're a kid in foster care. Yeah,
that is so powerful. And I was listening
amazing.
to you talk about sort of those photos and how it really sort of brought data, I guess, that you wouldn't have gotten any other way.
Yeah.
That was very personal for each. Yet, it gave you a sense of sort of like, using probably those visual images really enriched all conversations later on about what that meant for them. And it actually made me think of an article that I read a couple of years, now it's a couple of years old, and it was about moms with all kinds of disabilities. And photo voice also had been used in terms of identifying sort of, their life and any narrative around accessibility. And those photos, I had seen some of them, were also very evocative. And an example that will always sort of stay with me was this pile of dirty laundry in one of the photos. And the mom who took that photo had said, yeah, workers come in my apartment and keep telling me, like, you should do the laundry, you should do the laundry, you should do the laundry. Yet none of them has asked me, with my physical disability, if I can access the laundromat that's 3 floors down. And so for her, that was like an image that was very, important in her daily sort of struggles of accessibility. And so I find that it's very, sometimes when we can't find words, and sometimes it is difficult, and I would say with children probably even more, that we're given sort of another tool to be able to get sort of to the core of what it is. Yeah.
God,
so
and that's
awesome.
a perfect image. Yeah, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? And actually, yes, because part of why we did this, and I think the same as the study you're talking about, is to really sort of, throw this up to workers in a way. We did this as a research to practice, and it's really, this study really hit home. So the state government department did a webinar. It's been shared. It's part of training for workers now, and I think that's a testament to something that's going to have a lasting impact, because they're having discussions now about what questions are we not asking. What are we not asking, like about where the laundromat is and how accessible it is? What are we not asking about how we can help this child feel this is their home and really feel that sense of safety and permanency, rather than us just assuming we know what it is as adults. So yeah, spot on. Yeah.
And the other thing that I would add also is I have a very strong interest in like life stories and using storytelling, to build sort of like a sense of identity and sort of be able to be reminded. And so in a way also those photos could be used for them in terms of later on to be able to say, like, this were the cookies that I baked, and this was, the park that I went to when I walked my dog, and sort of that becomes their own sort of, I guess, storytelling and legacy in some way that they carry with them. So
that's so true, because life story work is about doing that. And that was one of our recommendations was, ask children directly. Don't just ask the carer what the child needs. Ask the child, and ask them in ways that they can communicate back to you best. Ask in a variety of ways, and kind of get to know that. Again, it's the message is get to know this child and what's important in their world. And we did say that, photographs are a great way. And it doesn't have to be in a therapeutic context where a professional trained clinical psychologist does it. You can do it as a caseworker. You can do this work. We're all part of this support structure around this child and this family. And there's no stopping you from doing the same thing. Yeah. It doesn't have to just be a research tool either. Yeah.
Which is amazing, because basically, I mean, that's what you talk about, right? It's like you did research, but with a sort of an end goal of something that would be useful and put back into practice. And I think that's the best way to do research, in my opinion. Or the one that I prefer, let's say, because
absolutely, yeah.
Well,
because we want to change the world, don't we, Marjorie? So
we do.
It's the best way to do research if you want
to
change things. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we could go on and on, because it's always fascinating to dive into those specific questions. But let's move on to the third part of the podcast or the chat, where, knowing all of this and knowing that you've done research that you haven't spoken about as well, where do you see sort of the field of parents and parenting with intellectual disabilities go in the future? I'll leave it open like that.
Yeah. So I know we've had conversations and about inclusive research and really kind of coming to understand what this means. I mean, there's we have some level of understanding of the importance of nothing about us without us. And there is the disability research field has led the way in terms of inclusive research. I would still argue it's in its infancy in terms of intellectual disability inclusive research, and genuine sort of partnership and to support people with intellectual disability to lead research. So I guess I think that's what I'm really, it's the fire in my belly. And I guess what inspires me is trying to find ways to support lived experience experts, and to work alongside them and to develop their skills and to understand what it is that they think the research questions that we should be tackling are. And again, as I guess I kind of talked about earlier too, some of that is really about building strong relationships, not just with individuals, but with the services and organisations and advocacy bodies who know and support and have relationships with people with intellectual disability who have already said, we want to be leaders, please involve us, please let us take this. And I'm really excited by where this can take us, Marjorie. I feel like it's completely untapped potential, and there are some excellent groups forming in Australia that are kind of a part of that family inclusion network, particularly around child protection involvement, and leadership in that I think has, again, not really involved parents with intellectual disability, but we are starting to see greater interest in hearing and involving those parents meaningfully with the support of their allies, because we can't just do business as usual. We have to adapt our approach to make sure that this is genuine inclusion and genuinely led by those parents. And we've done a tiny little study. It's very, very small, and I won't talk about it here, but it's been working with a group of 6 mothers with intellectual disability, and we just finished it, and we're really hoping that it will lead to other opportunities for those people, and for us to work with that group, because they are quite simply, amazing and inspiring, and have, again, messages that need to be heard. And so that's an emerging area that I'm really fascinated by, and I hope to see more of more research that is reporting on studies that have used co-design and co-research with parents with intellectual disability.
And what I like also, because I've heard of some initiatives that you've taken, you and your team and the people you work with. I know that also when you talk about inclusive research, it's not just a name on a paper, that you're actually really doing inclusive research where, they lead in terms of like their questions and what they want to talk about. And I think that's really like how we could be efficient in doing that. It's not just like, oh yeah, I asked a few questions to like 3 people, but it's actually involving them in from the ground up, building
That's
the research.
Yeah, and children and young people. Actually, I think that's something we haven't yet also heard enough of. There are some, again, if we're thinking about change, social change, and social movements, I think, there is also opportunities for young people and young adults who have been raised by parents with intellectual disability to be part of the conversation in a more active way, and for them to tell us what research would have been useful, what would have been helpful, what questions they would have wanted answered to. Marjorie, I think, again, I know there's so much to talk about, but yeah, I guess I'd just say,
hey, maybe we'll continue this conversation in another one, because I think that it's fascinating in terms of what we could do. Definitely. So I will ask you one last question. If you were able to talk to childcare workers right now about their work, what would you want them to hear?
I think the main thing that strikes me that one of the biggest things that gets in the way is feeling a sense of hopelessness, feeling that things are stacked up against families, and that there isn't a way through without sort of state intervention, statutory. You can't, that you as a worker feel alone, and you can't see being able to, I guess, reduce risks or build that connection that you want. There's not enough time. There's all of those problems. And I think I would just like to encourage workers to, I guess, fake it till you make it, really kind of believe in the potential of families to thrive, families and parents with intellectual disabilities, and find the people in their life who can help them thrive. Be one of those people, believe in them, listen to them, listen to what they think is important, and find other people to in their lives. There are other people, you know, circles of support around the parent. Building that community is critical, and you can only do that if you believe that whatever the problems they have can be changed, that they can, you know, you can be part of that change. Yeah.
Yeah, I like how you end, you know, one, in the belief that it's possible, and two, in also sort of talking about community, because, you know, each of us who are parents would tell you anyways that we didn't do it on our own.
No,
there were
no.
a lot of people involved, and I think it's, you know, it would be very unfair if we thought or sort of held parents with intellectual disabilities to a different standard, saying, no, you have to do it on your own.
Yeah, great point.
So I really liked, you know, how you brought community into it, and also sort of to talk with the person and sort of say, like, had you figured, you know, who could help out in your network already there? Yeah. So I want to thank you so much for having this chat with me. And who knows, maybe we'll have, you know, another chat at another time to discuss about all of the other stuff that we wish we had time to discuss this time around. So thank you so much, Susan, for the time.